to here. Okay, good. So for them, since I've got two classes with like 30, 35 apiece for that, I will be doing their role a different way. There'll be just a discussion thing each week, which I'll be putting up each Wednesday, which is to say today, and well, they'll see that later today. So for those of you online that are hopefully listening to this video, be on the lookout for that. Make sure you get it done by next week, so I know you're in my class. As for the rest of you that are actually here, any questions before we move on with the rest of the material?
We have to do a discussion?
No. No. You're physically here. That's good enough for me. No, my online classes, the discussion day is just real simple stuff. For this first week, it's going to be like, what do you look forward to learning in this course? It's really just to make sure they're paying attention in class and actually physical, like watching the videos. But no, for you in-person people, you're here looking at me, so I know you're here. So you guys won't even see the discussion stuff because you're in a different module. Anything else? Okay, well, let's get into this. Let's see, hopefully I can remember to, I've got a small video I want to show you guys near the end of class. Hopefully I can cut it properly because I can't show it on the stream because YouTube doesn't like when you show YouTube videos in your own YouTube video. Despite this one being like really old at this point. But it's okay, we'll figure it out. So, right, we ended with this, finishing up on Portugal, and really the main thing for this one is the rest of Europe trying to play catch up, expanding their economies and war-making abilities, and for our purposes, pushing into different forms of slavery, in particular the African slave trade, which still at this point, which I mean I'll get into in just a second, wasn't the like inherited by race slave trade we'll see in America in a few hundred years, but it was definitely moving that direction, as we're about to see. So early on, when Europeans thought about Africa, they only really knew North Africa because it's Europe's to the north of the Mediterranean and Africa's to the south of the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean is not really that big. So they knew about Northern Africa, which was largely controlled by large Muslim kingdoms, and then of course there's Egypt there to the east, and then further connections eastward into, you know, the Great Silk Road and the Near East and Asia and all that stuff. However, with Portugal heading down the coast of West Africa and with European settlers, well not settlers, European explorers setting up trade posts, they began running into sub-Saharan Africa, tribal regions, and the slaves there, the dirty, tired, exhausted, the usually warriors that were captured in tribal conflicts, which then began to characterize how Europeans thought of Africans. Also, then it did become a thing of race, and, well, I remember being taught this as a young one. These people were assigned by God into a life of bondage. There was this Christian belief that they were the cursed sons of Ham and that they were made slaves by God, and therefore it was a good thing that they were enslaved. This goes way back to the story of Noah after the whole, genocide flood thing. Noah decided he was going to get drunk, and as any drunk, 800-year-old man would do, he got naked and passed out. And apparently Ham walked in and saw him nude and was like, Dad's drunk and nude, passed out on the floor. I'm going to go tell my brothers. And he went and told his brothers, and his brothers decided they would walk in backwards so they wouldn't see their nude dad laying on the floor and throw a blanket over him. And then once Noah woke up, he was like, I know that my son Ham saw me nude on the floor, so I'm going to curse him. It's like, you were the one that was drunk nude on the floor. Why is it your son's fault that he walked in to you being nude on the floor? But whatever, apparently it's Ham's fault. So all of Ham's descendants were cursed with the burden of slavery or whatever. And so the Europeans' justification of that was the mark of Ham was melanin, I guess. So, yeah. And this was used well up into the Civil War of, oh no, it's not us saying that they should be slaves because their skin's darker than ours. It was the Bible.
Don't Mormons still believe that?
Well,
It's
they,
not the son of Ham, it's
not anymore, but that was a big part of their founding, yes. They can't be in the church because son of Ham thing. Yeah, that was a big part of Mormon theology early on. And by early on, I mean up until the 80s. Needless to say, it wasn't just Muslim kingdoms in the north and then just dirt poor tribes in the south. Africa was full of all sorts of different kingdoms and tribes, smaller societies. The book mentions here a lot of different groups. There were a lot of matriarchal societies, which you rarely see in the world. Some in Africa. There were also some in Asia, but that's a different class entirely. Some groups even converted to Christianity and were like, hey, Portuguese, we're Christian now too. Maybe don't take our people and sell them into slavery. But needless to say, that didn't happen. But again, and I mean, it's hard to go back and say, well, this slavery wasn't as bad as it would get. But on a scale, it wasn't as bad as it would get. It was still slavery, which is bad. Slavery's always bad. But it wasn't as bad as it would be in just a few centuries. This was still they would take Africans and make them work, and then a lot of times they would, after a few years, if they survived, because a lot of this was, let's just take people and work them to death, they'd be allowed to have a plot of land and, work it on their own. But there was other bound labor, peasants, indentured servants, criminals, apprentices, etc. I mean, we still do this today, convict labor's a thing. We'll actually get into that next semester. In fact, Slavic workers, folks from Eastern Europe, they were ubiquitous. They were very, very common, especially in the sugar plantations in the Mediterranean. Caribbean. I always get those two mixed up for some reason. The Caribbean. To the point that that's where we get the English word slave from, because there were so many Slavic workers that they just kind of morphed into slave. And again, eventually it just morphed into we only use slaves from Africa, but for a while it was just whoever people could get their hands on. It's just it was cheaper to use ones that we didn't have to pay at all. And then also the whole like racism thing of like, well, they're not white and don't look like us, so yeah. Oh, speaking of don't look like us, I'm about to show you some images of European, let's say, ideas of Africans back in the 1500s. It's bad. But it's I can't describe it to you in any better way than just showing it. So here we go. Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah, and like I don't know. It's like I don't know why their heads are in their chests. Like I don't know where that would have come from. Like where the misinterpretation of that would come from at all. This is more of a stage play in like London, where they would build these big like wooden sculpture heads, and the people would crawl out of them, and it's like, oh, this cannibals in the rainforest or whatever. But again, the weird like head chest thing was fairly common. It's weird. Also, this dude's riding a unicorn, so I don't know. The what now?
On TikTok, YouTube and stuff, there was huge, like, puppets, wooden puppets, that they were lowering in the water. Have you ever seen that? It's crazy. They make them, they're just big puppets, and they make them, like, dance. So they feel,
Yeah, I was gonna say, who's they?
I don't know, but there's videos, there's this one little man, they aren't little, and then this woman, and then there's this baby with the woman. Because he pulled up pictures of big puppets.
As long as it's not Roger from Mud Fossil University, it's like this mountain range looks like a dragon. Therefore, there was a dragon that was 400 miles long back in the day. It's like, no, dude, it's a mountain range.
No, these are big, creepy wooden puppets.
Okay,
I guess they're trying to make us look subhuman.
I guess, but I mean, that's just like
Like an alien.
that's weird, man.
It's true.
So, meanwhile, back to the Atlantic. The first Europeans to actually discover North America were the Norsemen. Not specifically Vikings, because Viking is it's not really a specific term, it's more of a general term for like raider or pirate or adventurer. These were Norse explorers. The first one being Eric the Red. Leif Erikson, I think, was actually the first one to make it all the way to North America. But they found, Iceland and then Greenland and then North America proper, and I'll actually get into those naming schemes when we get to the map. So around 1000 CE, they discovered North America. They had some settlements. We have evidence of their interactions with Native Americans. However, around 1450, the planet began cooling again, and there was a little ice age, and the glaciers started to move down again, and they had to abandon a lot of these settlements. So they just left and went back to Scandinavia. And they also weren't like communicating with the rest of Europe, so that's why like there's no big Leif Erikson Day. Well, there's probably Leif Erikson Day in Scandinavia. They do their own thing. But no, we have this asshole, who I will go into greater detail with in just a minute. A fella from Genoa named Christopher Columbus. He wrongly believed that the world was much smaller than it was. And he's like, hey, if we just go west, we'll eventually get to Japan and China and India. I mean, eventually is correct, but his eventually was a lot smaller than it actually would have been. Like, yeah, but let's go this way, and it'll be right back around. Unlike what you folks would have maybe learned in grade school, he wasn't the only person who believed the world was round. Everybody knew that. It wasn't like today where people are eating lead paint and like, oh, the world's flat. It was, everybody understood that. People have understood that since like the ancient Greeks. Anyway, I'm not going to get on that right now. However, most other countries told Columbus he could shove it because that was going to be expensive and the world was much larger than he thought it was. They were actually correct. And if the Americas weren't here and it was just the Atlantic and Pacific as one big like mega ocean, he and his men would have all died. Or more likely, his men would have shanked him and thrown him overboard and come back home, because they almost did that anyway. They never would have made it. So he eventually went to Spain because the Mediterranean was under the control of Italy. The path around the southern tip of Africa was controlled by Portugal. So the only real way to go was across the Atlantic. And still, King Ferdinand told Christopher Columbus, he could sit and spin. Isabella, though, thought maybe it was a decent idea, and they had money to burn. Why not? Queen Isabella, let me rephrase that. This was right after the unification of Spain. I shouldn't say reunification. Spain wasn't a thing before this. Spain had unified into not quite what it is today, but a much more powerful nation than it had ever been before. And Isabella, who was in control of half of what is modern-day Spain, and Ferdinand, who had the other half, when they married and united the crown, they each kept what power they had, rather than, well, the king's in charge because he's got a wiener. So Isabella actually had like equal power. In fact, in some people's minds, she might have had more power than Ferdinand. This is also the time in history when the queen piece in chess gained the current OP power that it has today, where it can do like everybody's move except for just like the knight. It used to be it could do the same things as the king, just like one in any direction. But with Isabella doing all the things she was doing, whoever was making the rules for chess was like, we're going to give the queen everybody's moves because Isabella's kicking ass. Anyway, she gave Columbus the money to create the enterprise of the Indies. Columbus put some ships together and headed west, and very nearly got thrown overboard because it was taking forever. And they didn't know how long it was going to be. And just before his men decided that they were going to offer him up to Poseidon and head home, they ran into a little island that Columbus named San Salvador because that little bit of land saved his butt. He believed he had found the Indies. He had not. And despite, landing there and meeting the people and seeing their homes, he was convinced he had found China and India and Japan and all of that. It's like, but we've got all the descriptions from Marco Polo of like the big cities and the buildings and the people and their like stuff. And then Columbus goes to this island where the natives live, and they've got their little like huts and simple farms and stuff. And he's like, yes, we're definitely in China. It's like, have you not read Marco Polo? The Pope, being the Pope, was just like, okay, everything that was discovered is now under the control of Spain, and Portugal's like, hey, we're here too. And so they gave everything, what was it, east of Cape Verde Islands. You don't need to know the details of this, but what this basically meant was once they began exploring more and they realized how far, well, once they found South America and realized how far west South America went, that's why Brazil is Portuguese. If you've ever looked at a map of Central and South America and looked at the languages, everything in Central and South America is Spanish except for Brazil is Portuguese, and this is why. I mean, barring a few islands, because the French and Spanish, or the French and English kind of involved. But as far as land mass, it's mostly Spanish, and then there's that bit of, I've got a map. There's a bit of Brazil that sticks out, and Portugal got involved there, and they're like, everything that this river drains from, we can take, and so they dug way into. They dug way into South America. That's why Brazil is so big, because it's basically anything that the Amazon gets, we can have. Because that was how they did lines of demarcation back then. It's just like, whatever this river touches, we can take. It's like, how does that count? That's how France did with the Mississippi, which we'll get to that too. Anyway, there's our boy Eric the Red. And Columbus, we'll also get into that in a little bit. And Queen Isabella. Oh yeah, by the way, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were busy with the Reconquista, which is to say they were murdering a lot of Muslims, because the Muslim. Do I have a map? Yeah. So, I mean, beginning right about here is where Islam began, and it spread up here and took Istanbul or Constantinople, Istanbul, and then through northern Africa, and then they went across here and took pretty much all of Spain before being stopped by the French. Before France was a thing. And then eventually they began getting pushed back, and most of Ferdinand and Isabella's reign was pushing the Moors, which is the Spanish Muslims, out of Spain. So they were actually much less concerned with the New World and more concerned with what was going on the Iberian Peninsula. Oh, right, and this is also the demarcation line, which is what gave Brazil to Portugal, and then they were like, hey, there's this river here, we're going to follow the river, and that's why Brazil is so freaking big. Also, there's stuff going on over here, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right. So, Columbus returned back to the Caribbean a few more times to claim more land for Spain. But with this not being Japan, China, and India, where they were supposed to be able to just go in and buy spices and then bring them home and sell them for a major profit, they had to do something different to make money, because that was the whole point of this exploration, was you put money in to have the ships built and hire the sailors, and they go across and they find something to bring back to sell to make the money back and then some profit. And finding a bunch of natives that get genocided isn't making money. So they eventually instituted a system of encomiendas. Basically, the men in the expedition would set up plantations, and the natives would be made to work the land, which, totally was fair for everybody. We'll get into the encomiendas in a little bit. By the time Columbus died in 1506, Spain had arrested him like twice for fraud and actually mistreatment of the natives, which, if you know anything about later Spanish explorers who did actually end up like genociding entire empires of natives, must have been something serious. And the islands under Spanish control were in complete chaos. So yeah, he wasn't doing a real good job. Columbus, I can't put this any other way. Columbus was a monster. Not to say he was any worse than any other explorer at the time, because they were all terrible. They were out to make money, and they didn't care who they killed to do it. And just like we were seeing with how the Africans were depicted, they saw these people living in this new world as less than human. And they treated them however they felt. And most of the time, that was poorly. They enslaved them, they killed them. I won't even go into how they treated the women. It was horrendous. And the way Columbus is treated in modern history is a really, really long-term rehabilitation of Columbus to try to gloss over the terrible things that these explorers did. Because it's like, oh, Cortez was terrible because he murdered all these people. It's like, so did this asshole. But the reason that he's remembered fondly is like, oh, well, he was the one that found America. And also, he was Italian and not Spanish. And Italian Americans who were being mistreated at the time that his rehabilitation happened were like, hey, we have an Italian hero, let's make him look not so bad, and then we have something to grasp onto to make Americans stop treating us like shit. Because anytime there was any group in America that wasn't like English American, they were treated like garbage. It's the, American cycle. So, yeah, it's a whole thing. So Columbus is dead. Nobody missed him. Everybody knew that we weren't in China. Nobody was confused to that point. But there was still some pretty strong interest that, hey, we've discovered new land. This is kind of a big deal. Now, granted, they weren't quite in, the Aztec, Maya, Inca area yet where there's just gold laying around. But still, this was like going to the moon for them. Because for literally thousands of years, the only thing Europeans knew were, Europe, the classical regions, so, like the Middle East, as told in the Bible, Greece, Rome, but that's part of Europe anyway. A little bit of Asia, but that was still kind of like this mysterious, unknown region, but we know it's there, we just don't know much about it. We don't really bother Russia because they're crazy. And Africa was also this sort of unknown region, but we know it exists. We just can't go there because the malaria will kill us. But this idea of there's this land that nobody knows about, it was mind-blowing to them. So, 1497, we had John Cabot, or Caboto, because he was also from Genoa. He was also Italian. The English hired him, sent him west to North America to do some scouting. He discovered eastern Canada, and England was like, cool. They did nothing for like 100 years. That was it. The only people that did anything for literally the rest of this entire chapter were the Portuguese and the Spanish. So the Portuguese and Spanish got pushed into the Caribbean. Amerigo Vespucci, who was he wasn't really an explorer. He rode along with expeditions, but his main thing was writing about them, and his journals would go back to Europe, and then they would get printed because, as we're going to see here in, I think it's literally the next slide, printing presses would allow for these journals to spread all throughout Europe, and people would read them and learn about what people were seeing in the New World. Anyway, long story short, Amerigo Vespucci's accounts led the map maker Martin Waldseemüller, and you can tell from the name he's German, to actually name the new continents, or the one that they'd actually run into so far, the southern continent, because they hadn't actually really discovered much of North America yet. America. Thank God they didn't go with Vespucci. So yeah, it was just like a random dude who wrote a lot of accounts, which were often a bit exaggerated, because that's what people did. And then a map maker who decided, hey, that's pretty cool. I'm going to name the continent after this guy. And it stuck. So, yeah, that's where we got America from. Who would have thunk it? So there's the Inca Media. So the idea of it was that the Spanish settlers would protect, care for, and Christianize the natives. Now, the idea of Christianizing was identical to their idea of civilizing, so they would help the natives become basically more advanced, better irrigation and tools, and just kind of advance their society more towards what Spain had at the time. And in return, the natives would work a portion of their time for the Spanish settlers. Okay, cool. It's this part-time work for the Spanish helping to take care of them. Neat. What actually happened? Well, the Spanish settlers would force long labor, not pay them, not protect them, because the natives were often fighting each other because they weren't like a homogeneous group. They were different tribes that were often in conflict, and would take native lands. Boy, that sounds familiar. We'll be talking about that a lot for the rest of the semester and next semester. Natives would often die from disease, which we'll go into greater detail in a little bit. Harsh living and working conditions. Not so great. So eventually, there would be clergy protests that ended the Encamidas. I went into great detail with that when I was in grad school. As well as the natives revolting because, hey, we don't like dying. It's not great. So the system was replaced by repartimentio, which I guess was meant to take better care of the natives, and then it just ended up being as bad as the Encamidas to begin with. So, good job, Spain. And here are these early exploration routes. So you've got Eric the Red here, Eric the Red made it to Greenland. Leif Erikson actually made it to North America. Bjarmi Jarfsson, he didn't actually make it to the land there. So yeah, Leif Erikson actually made it to North America. I keep getting the pair mixed up. Eric the Red made it to Greenland. Anyway, Iceland and Greenland, you can tell from the map here, there's a difference in the ice and the green. The Norse named it that on purpose. They got here and it's like, hey, there's a lot of like good farming land here. And then they got here, it's like, man, this place is covered in ice. Let's swap the names so anybody that finds our maps will go here instead. Yeah, they were great. There's the voyages Vespucci went on. Again, he wasn't leading the voyages. He was just like riding along and taking accounts of what was going on. He was like the scribe, I guess, to use like a really old term. He wrote down what he saw and brought him back home, and everybody got to read about what he witnessed, which again was often very exaggerated. It's like, oh, the natives breathed fire and all sorts of stuff. Actually, I think, was this the one? It was either here or somewhere in the Pacific where supposedly like the native women would trade sexual favors for iron. And it got so bad that like the boats started losing structural integrity because the sailors were pulling nails out of the ship to have iron to give to the native women. Yeah. At least it's better than what Columbus and his guys were doing. At least this one there was trade going on. Oh, here's a map. I've got a series of maps. This is the first one. I'll show you another one in a little bit. You can, I mean, besides apologies for the quality, but you can see where like the Mediterranean looks like the Mediterranean. You've got Italy and the islands here and Greece, and then you've got Spain and whatnot. But then as you get further away from that, it starts to kind of get warped because I mean, they did their best. And especially as you get here towards Asia, they're like, we don't know. It's like we know there's islands out here, but we don't really know the scale. And then with North America, it's neat. It's like they've got the Caribbean, and they understand like the land here. And they know that South America goes down, but they don't know where it ends. And they know North America goes up, but they don't know where it ends. And they don't know how wide it is, so it's just like we know it's long, we don't know how wide, but it's cool to see like these evolving maps of what they understand. Because the next one I'm going to show you guys, they've gone around South America, so you can actually see the extent of that. And also to further say, this map is specifically made to indicate a rounded Earth because people weren't dumb. All right. So around this time, we have Vasco de Balboa. Vasco Nunez de Balboa. He went across the Isthmus of Darien, which is modern-day Panama, and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean, which I would have assumed that Marco Polo had seen the Pacific, considering he went all the way across China and like traveled out in the sea a little bit, but I don't know. Also, technically, it was like, I'll show you guys in a minute like what amount of the Pacific it was. And also, he named it the Pacific because what he was looking at was very calm and peaceful, but he was looking into like a bay. It's like, oh, this is such a peaceful ocean. It's like you're not looking at the Pacific. The Pacific is a wild, dangerous ocean. Meanwhile, Juan Ponce de Leon found and explored a little bit of Florida, which is to say that he went along the coast of it. It's like, wow, this land has a lot of flowers, so he's going to name it the Flowery Land, which meant Florida, or, well, is what Florida means. He was trying to find some riches and didn't find any riches, which was all well and good because Florida is mud and alligators. Ah, yes, Ferdinand Magellan. This is, we'll come back to this because I've got a video on this, but again, I can't show it in the middle of a stream. I'll post the link for the video for my online students, but for you guys, we'll watch it at the end. So, Ferdinand Magellan, he had a different sort of idea. He was going to set off from Spain, head west, and keep going west until he got back to Spain from the east. Now, again, everybody knew this was possible. Unfortunately, it was 1519, and they had 1519 technology, and they didn't know much beyond that there was land kind of in the middle, and then there was land over here, and they didn't know what was in between. So the whole Pacific Ocean was kind of an unknown. And that's a lot of ocean, like even today. That's a lot of ocean. Scurvy, hostile natives, bad weather, and his own men attempting to mutiny against him nearly ended the voyage before they even got to South America. That's not even the halfway point. Like, South America is like a third of the way. Not even, really thinking about it, because the Pacific is so big. Yeah, so they barely made it across the Atlantic before everything had already gone to hell. Anyway, within 2 years of leaving, they made it to the Philippines in March of 1521, and then Magellan got shanked. The natives didn't appreciate him and his boys being there, and he got killed. But one of his 5 ships made it back, along with 18 men out of, the book doesn't say how many crew began, but I feel like 18 people to run a sailing ship is probably pretty close to a skeleton crew. But they did manage to pack on as many expensive spices as they could before they got there, and I guess technically, since they had a body in the Philippines, Spain was able to claim the Philippines, which is something that'll actually come up next semester. So I probably won't remember to bring that up, but that's the thing. And we'll do this little video once we get closer to the end of class, because again, I can't show it on the stream. So here we have Balboa's route, traveled across the Isthmus of Panama, which, I mean, again, that's not a whole lot of land, but it was all jungle, so I imagine it was quite the trip. And then it's like, oh, look at this peaceful ocean. It's like, my dude, it's a bay, essentially. I mean, I guess technically that, I need to quit pointing at it, and there's online students. I guess that's technically a bay, but even this is still more protected than the Pacific Ocean. There's Ponce de Leon's travels. Oh yeah, we'll get to St. Augustine later, but this was like this was the first, this will be in the notes a little bit later, but this was the first permanent settlement in North America, and for a long time the only one. Like we talk about, oh, Jamestown was the first English permanent settlement, but that was like 200 years later. Like, St. Augustine's been there forever. Because for a long time it was just Spain in North America. The other European countries didn't do much of anything. There's Magellan's route, and I was telling the other students yesterday. Most of you folks probably wouldn't remember this because you were all very small children, but before smartphones were a thing, GPSs were like standalone devices. all had their own like separate companies, their own separate brands. And one such brand was the Magellan. And now thinking back, that's kind of funny because he spent most of his time lost and then didn't actually make it home. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that company doesn't exist anymore. But I just thought, like, I remember that halfway through teaching this yesterday. It's like, oh yeah, there was like a GPS called the Magellan. That's bad. But yeah, that's his route. You know, had to go all the way around South America, then up to the Pacific. I mean, where's it at? Where's my mouse? Sharks Islands. That's terrifying. I wonder what they saw there. And then across this way to what will become the Mariana Islands. And then down here into the Philippines, where he got himself stabbed. There he is. And then what was left of us boys got home. Oh, right. See, normally I'd have shown you the video by now, but there we go. If you don't know what's going on, don't worry. You will in a little while. All right. So, making, printing, and distributing maps, as well as journals, came off the back of a number of technological advances. Now, of course, China was ahead of Europe by literal centuries. Back in like 1000 CE, they had wood block printing. No, actually, 10th century, that'd be 900. Johann Gutenberg did not invent the printing press. He used China's printing press and just like instead of using Chinese characters, used, I guess, European characters, because I mean I can't say English because he was German, but you know, Germanic characters that could be easily used for other European languages. So he did not invent the printing press. He stole the intellectual property from China and modified it to work in Europe. Between 1452 and 1455, he used this to print 180 copies of the Bible. So the Bible was the first thing printed on the printing press. Who knows what the second thing was? Because you can print more than just like words. Not music. Hmm? Yes. It was a picture. No.
I don't know. He said Bible first.
It was let's say it was the other direction.
Oh, Satan.
No, it was porn. It was lewd woodblock prints. Yeah, so we'll get into more of weird woodblock prints later. Yeah, the printing press was interesting. Also, I don't remember exactly what it was Gutenberg did. Who is texting me? Oh, it's Brent. I don't remember what it was Gutenberg did, but he like got in trouble for fraud or not paying his taxes or something. Anyway, the government seized all his assets, and printing presses spread all throughout Europe, and within like 100 years, every major city in Europe had a printing press. So Gutenberg's loss was like the world's gain. Sucks for Gutenberg, but he stole the idea anyway, so. But yeah, so then everybody in Europe was able to print books and maps and pamphlets with questionable content, and this would allow, well, for many things. For one, as you'd see in my European history course if you take it, it allowed for the spread of knowledge. School books could then be printed more cheaply than, I know you think today it's like school books cheap, but no, it was more than your tuition was what books cost. But then journals from explorers, maps could be spread more quickly. So the interest and enthusiasm for this new world began to surge again. Were it not for this, we'd all be speaking Spanish, I imagine, because Spain would have been the only country that would have bothered. And then just to mention, the natives also did their own thing when it came to map making, although it was less maps and more just like marking off land. The Maya, for example, had glyphs called stela, described boundaries and history and all sorts of stuff. But again, the book unfortunately doesn't go into very much detail with that, so it's just kind of a side note. That's the Chinese characters. Again, with a language that has so many different characters, that was a bit of a nightmare. So here's a printing press, and I assume one of the Germanic states. And Germany didn't exist as a country back then. That's a different class. So you had the dudes in the back that would, well, actually, let's see. Start here. You would put each individual letter onto the block, and then you'd lock it into place. And then you'd set it back here, and this guy would blot ink onto it. And you'd lock it into this, and put the paper underneath it. And this guy would turn this crank, which apparently was very heavy, and you print the page. And then you also had like unpaid children to come in and do menial labor, including like bringing beer to the workers, because drinking on the job was just part of what you did back then. Oh, speaking of which, not drinking on the job. Here's an updated map. You can see that it's much closer to modern day. Africa's still a little bit large, a little bit bulbous, but it looks way more in line with Europe. India actually exists now. Arabia is in better shape. Asia's still a little bit up in the air, but the East Indies are actually pretty much as they would be, just a little bit too big because they're trying to emphasize each individual island. But yeah, this is actually really good shape. South America is still a little bit wobbly, but we've got the other end of it all the way up here. I think that we actually got, Southern California even. They didn't go up much further, so we still don't know the extent of North America yet. So North America is actually still the unknown. But as you can see, this one's a big improvement over the previous one. All right. One more section, then we can watch the video. So, the Columbian Exchange. As the Spaniards rolled in and started taking stuff, they were aided by disease. Now, oftentimes they didn't do it on purpose, but once they started realizing what was going on, they very much did it on purpose. So due to continental drift, North America and Europe had been separated for millennia. And Native Americans had no kind of immunity to European germs. So to give us some numbers here, the Inca had a population of about 9 million in 1530. And by 1630, they had dropped to less than 500,000. The Aztecs and Maya, about 40 million total, dropped to about 3 million by 1650. Now, the book mentions, this was more devastating than the bubonic plague. This was significantly more devastating than the bubonic plague. I mentioned in the notes that, about half of Europe was killed in the bubonic plague. That was the worst case scenario. Some cities lost about half, and that was the worst hit cities. Overall, Europe lost about a third of its population, which is still utterly devastating for a civilization. This is 90 to 95%. This is basically everybody. There's no coming back from that. That's destroying the entire civilization. I mean, if you've got a city of 10,000 people and 1,000 are left, that city's gone. So the Columbian Exchange is a term for the transfer of disease, flora, and fauna between the Americas, Africa, and Europe. And again, the main thing for the conquest of North America was this spread of disease. It was, as we're going to see in greater detail next time, especially as the Spaniards start coming in and really putting the natives to the sword, it was that disease that really did it, because the Spanish didn't send very many soldiers number-wise, but they realized all they had to do was go through a city and then just leave, and once they came back within a few months, the city was pretty much dead. And speaking of disease, it was the partial immunity of the African laborers that made them, the target of more exploitation. They were partially immune to malaria and yellow fever, and therefore they were often sent in greater number to the Caribbean, because the Caribbean was also full of malaria and yellow fever, and that was quite common in Africa, and due to situational evolution, which is to say sickle cell anemia, oftentimes they would be at least partially immune to it and could survive working there. Now, granted, a lot of times they'd be worked to death anyway, but at least they wouldn't die from just immediate exposure to the bugs. Europeans also introduced pigs and iron to America. Again, there were things that just didn't exist in the Americas that the Europeans brought over. So, the wild boars that exist here in North America, they're just pigs that got loose and became feral. Pigs are weird like that. If I brought in a pig today, a little pink, regular-ass pig, and we let it loose in the woods and put a tracker on it, and at the end of the semester went out and found it, its hair will be longer, it will be bristly, it would start growing tusks. They start changing as their environment changes, real quick. Speaking of resources, American resources besides the gold that was stolen from the Aztecs, Maya, and Inca, included maize, so corn, potatoes, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, etc. And while a lot of this was developed in Asia, was widely grown in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean had just really good islands for growing this stuff, and that's going to be another major part of what we talk about once North America starts getting settled. So this began not just the Columbian Exchange, but what would become known as the triangular trade. So they took labor from Africa to produce raw resources in America, to then ship to Europe to turn into manufactured goods. So you had this triangle across the Atlantic. So we have that here with a few other ideas. Again, disease here: smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria. Well, malaria was kind of everywhere. Diphtheria, whooping cough. All sorts of fun, horrible stuff to murder people with. Yeah, tomatoes weren't in Europe. That wasn't a thing. And actually, for a while, tomatoes were seen as dangerous for two reasons. One, they're actually related to nightshade, which if you're not familiar with nightshade, that's like the #1 ingredient in poisons, at least back then. It's just a plant, but it's very poisonous. Does anybody know the other reason why tomatoes were seen as like?
They had them on arsenic plates, and so they eat it off.
Yeah, the plates were pewter, and
They also wore arsenic hats and stuff.
yeah, the hats. Well, I don't know if it was so much arsenic, but it was the mercury. Yeah, but yeah, the plates were made of pewter, and the acidic juice from the tomatoes would cause it to leach out, and yeah, it was. But it didn't hurt the poor folks because they had just like wooden bowls and stuff, so they were fine. But yes, I was getting ready to say someone in my previous class knew that too. So I'm glad that information seems to be a bit more common knowledge than it used to. I think it's interesting. So it's neat. All right. We're going to talk about the native empires next time. So let me pull up the video for you guys after I close the stream. So for you stream folks, I will put the link up with everything else on Blackboard. So